This is the Polo Dune, this is the Rover Streetwise, and this is a Citroen C3 XTR, all three of which look just like little rugged 4x4 off-roaders. The catch? None of them are 4x4s. They're all big fat phonies, as only their front wheels do any putting of power down to the road, and they're not specifically designed to be exceptional off-roaders as a result. So you could call them 4x4s. But for some reason, VW, Rover and Citroen decided in the early 2000s that these were essential offerings to put out on sale to test how good they'd be. Sadly, none of the three got renewed for further generations, leading me to wonder, why did they even exist in the first place? Were they successful at all, and why did they not get a longer run? All that and more coming up. Before we get into it, make sure to hit the like button if you want to see 2 videos every single week, subscribe as well if you're new here, and let me know in the comments which of these 3 cars you'd like to own the most. I'll let you know mine at the end of the video. Without further ado, let's get into it. To make any sense of these 3 cars, let's go back to June 1983 when Fiat released the first generation Fiat Panda 4x4 with a little 1 litre engine making just 48 brake horsepower, so nothing special. But what was special was that all-wheel drive layout, which made the car the first small transverse engined production car in the world to have an all-wheel drive system. You might recognise it from the Grand Tour when James May drove one around Colombia, testing just how rugged and 4x4 like it actually is. I mean, from the spec sheet, it did actually come with some good off-roading features, like the ultra-low first gear to pull you out of sticky situations, and the body shell was reinforced to take more of a battering. It did, however, also sit on leaf springs and still came in some additional specs depending on what you wanted to use it for, like the trekking spec. As a Super Mini, it was very different to many of its rivals in this way, where Super Minis had generally been marketed as city cars to run errands in and take short trips where words like agility, nip, squeeze and sneak were far more important than words like climb, trek, smash and overcome. You don't see many farmers with VW Polos or Citroen C3s as their weapons of choice for batting around their farms, but the Mark I Panda 4x4 remains in use by many farmers across Europe for its usability, practicality, simplicity and ruggedness. As a result of this car's relative success, the Panda 4x4 has remained through the second and third generations, still through to today. In both of those guises, however, it was far less rugged and a bit more city focused, just maintaining some of the essences that made the first gen so popular. So when the second generation came out in 2002, it was closely followed by the Rover Streetwise in 2003, the Polo Dune in 2004, and the C3 XTR in 2005, all seeking to take some of that market share of people after a more rugged Super Mini that they could get down and dirty in. But could they really hold a candle to the Panda? Well, let's take a look then, starting with the Rover Streetwise, which came when MG Rover Group decided to put some love and attention into the Rover brand and get rid of its image as being a car for the elderly. They built this on-roader with inspiration from cars like the Audi A6 Allroad, Volvo XC70 Cross Country and Skoda Octavia Scout, all of which have this on-roader look and feel with the unpainted plastic bumpers that are ready for you to crash into rocks and tree stumps and mud and that kind of stuff. It got an extra 10mm in height above the standard Rover 25, some multi-purpose roof bars, some different alloy wheels, some minor interior changes and options, and of course the bumpers that I mentioned, though generally it was the same car as the 25. It ran from 2003 to 2005 before Rover ceased trading altogether and then weirdly returned to life again from 2008 to 2011 only in China after Rover was bought up and revived by Nanjing Automobile. What's even more crazy is that Rover designed and built a car that was effectively the first in its segment at a time where the business was suffering so much. It came as a surprise to many, but VW and Citroen very quickly jumped on it too, validating Rover's decision making. They were effectively a class leader. The Polo Dune was a similar formula to the Streetwise with those plastic bumpers throughout, some cool looking fog lights, some different alloys, raised ride height and the roof bars too, plus 3 engine options depending on how slow you wanted it to be. Outside of that, it was pretty much the same car as the Polo 9N that I drive, and it's the same story for the XTR, which had purely cosmetic changes for us here in the UK, though in Europe there was an additional LSD, raised suspension and sump guards, which is pretty cool. Don't drive a UK example as if it's an off-roader here though, because that sump remains entirely unguarded and the suspension remains unraised, so not much fun if you happen to collect a nice boulder. I think it's so funny that VW and Citroen seem to have copied what Rover did. Yes, it can be argued that Rover might have taken inspiration from what Fiat had been doing with the Panda, but they effectively created the formula for Super Mini faux off-roaders, and VW and Citroen applied that formula to their superminis. So did they sell well? Kind of, but not to what the manufacturers wanted, as VW hoped to sell 3,000 per year here in the UK and only ended up getting rid of around 350 to 450 year on year, dipping significantly by the end of the Mark IV Polo's lifespan. Similarly, at its peak there was little over 1,000 C3 XTRs on the roads in the UK and a couple thousand Streetwises. I think it's hard to call them a success for their time, considering no other major manufacturers offered anything similar, and they all ended production with no successors, except for the Polo Dune, which even then wasn't as good as VW promised, as initially their intention was to make a car that was all-wheel drive, showing that they thought they were going to have more success out of the car. Dunes were, by the way, called Cross Polos, Polo Funds, and Polo Sohos in some other markets, in case Dune doesn't mean anything to you. Basically, no, they weren't particularly successful, but that might have been because they came too soon and with the wrong set of bumpers. By the way, just as a side note, if you like the Polo Dune in particular, consider going for one from 2004 to early 2005 to get the 9N pre-facelift look rather than the 9N3 post-facelift look, because it's much harder to find the 9N on the Dune, and though I am biased, I personally think they look much cooler, but that's just me. What did I mean when I mentioned those bumpers? Well, I personally think these cars probably, to an extent, were doing the right thing in terms of where the market was going. Today we're in a time where SUVs are everywhere. In 2021 in the UK, SUVs accounted for half of vehicle registrations. Back when these three cars came out, SUVs were a class of their own. You either had one of many different types of car, or you had an SUV/4x4, which was much more interchangeably used as a term than it is today. Now there are multiple classes of SUV, like crossover SUV, small SUVs, subcompact crossover SUVs, mid-size SUVs, full-size SUVs, etc, etc, etc. These three cars were probably too small for any of those classes, but they would most likely fit into the subcompact crossover SUV class if they were released today, and they probably would look more like comfortable oversized versions of their normal size counterparts sitting on the same platform. Sort of exactly like the subcompact crossover SUV VW T-Cross, Seat Arona and Skoda Kamiq, which all sit on the same platform as their super mini counterparts, the Polo, Ibiza and Fabia. The Renault Captur is another example. I actually drove one earlier this year and it is literally a tall Clio. That's all I can possibly call it. And there are now plenty of other examples from the majority of all leading high volume car manufacturers. They tend to drop the ruggedness of the three cars we focused on in this video, but outside of that they remain the same basic formula. So what a strange trend, eh? I probably would have gone for the Polo Dune as my choice, but let me know in the comments down below what you would have gone for yourself. Huge thanks to the patrons for their support and to you guys as well for watching. Do hit like and subscribe if you haven't already, I'd really appreciate it. And I think having watched this video, you should probably go take a look at how Peugeot became a cool car brand again by clicking here.